So I read Rose McGowan's book, Brave, her autobiography. For those of you who are not familiar with Rose McGowan, she's most known, I would say, for two things. One of them is being an actress. She was in the original Scream movie. Other than that, I feel like in terms of films, she was mostly in independent, like cult classic type movies, like artsy sort of films as opposed to blockbuster type films. And then, of course, she's most known for her role as a witch on Charmed, the long-running TV series. So she's most known for that. And the other thing is her involvement in the Me Too movement. She was one of the actresses that came forward to talk about Harvey Weinstein and her experience with him. And the book basically joins those two parts of her life story together, like the how she became an actress and everything leading up to that, to her childhood, which was very dark. And then this whole other part of her and evolution basically as an activist. I've made a few videos on this channel years ago about the Me Too movement, my thoughts on it, especially as it pertains to gay men, meaning like how that's a whole other part of this that isn't really discussed, right? Like the Kevin Spacey type guys who seem to have mimicked the Bill Cosbys and the Harvey Weinsteins in terms of exploiting their power, their fame, their wealth to take advantage of younger guys, and how that's something that doesn't get spoken about as much, because I think the only thing that makes society feel more uncomfortable than a woman being sexually assaulted is a man being sexually assaulted. Actually, even more than that is a boy, like a child, being sexually assaulted. I think it makes people very uncomfortable because we have this notion in our society, right, that a man's manhood shouldn't be questioned, right? Like, it's bad enough for women to be exploited, but for a man to be sexually or physically exploited is something that makes people even more uncomfortable, because of, the masculinity stuff and all that stuff. Anyway, so I have made videos in the past, and I think in one of those videos I even mentioned how I've never been the biggest fan of Rose McGowan as an actress. I think she's great. She's very believable, very, very authentic. And it came across in the book that I think she's just a very unique person. But as it pertains to her activism and the Me Too stuff, she's been a very vocal part of the whole movement. And if you ask her, I'm sure she would, just even from reading the book, I don't think would want to be associated with the Me Too movement, because so much of it was hijacked for the sake of like a media moment. And I think she's right, but I also sense some hypocrisy in her sentiments, in that I feel that she also took a huge chunk out of it to make it about her story, which is still very valid, of course. But to me, and this is just my general philosophy, with all these movements, Black Lives Matter, Me Too movement, all this stuff, Time's Up, in general, I think when we focus too much on the details, we lose the bigger picture and the symbolism of these movements. So specifically with the Me Too movement, what I mean by that is, it became the focus on these Hollywood actresses. And at the end of the day, Hollywood actresses have way more of a voice than like the average, Jessica working in a corporate environment, getting all these like uncomfortable comments made to her, and she feels her salary is on the line if she says anything, right? I worked in environments where there was no HR. Like, going to HR was just not an option, or I knew that things would get worse if I went to HR. Like, it wouldn't work in my favor. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, I feel these movements, the bigger picture should be about giving a voice to the voiceless, not like making it into a Hollywood moment, which she probably would agree with. But did you guys hear that? Garbage truck outside, which always seems to happen when I'm creating a video. Anyway, so I'm also one of those people who feels delivery sometimes is just as important as the original message. Like, you know how you have a friend sometimes who you always understand why they're hurt and their intent, but their delivery sometimes, like to another friend or to a partner or to a boss, you're like, come on now, like that's not effective. And so that has been a frustration for me in observing Rose McGowan's sort of like campaign and in helping grow the conversations about people like Harvey Weinstein. Like sometimes her delivery has been so, I hate to use this word, but like aggressive. Not, it's more than aggressive, angry. I do believe that, like that saying, you get more with honey than you do with vinegar. Like your delivery affects how seriously people take your message. So anyway, I'm saying all that to say that I never thought I would read this book, honestly. And I knew the basics. Like I know that she's had a lot of difficulties. I'm sure it's completely traumatizing to go through what she went through with Harvey. Not just the actual incident of the assault from Harvey Weinstein, but then the aftermath of like people not believing you, being shamed by people in your industry, like your agent, and being kept quiet. Like that, in a sense, feels like a second assault, if that makes sense. So I understand that she has gone through a lot of trauma. And then even in her childhood, I knew that she had grown up in a cult, which is like so fascinating. And her whole thing is like, I basically got transferred from one cult to another. But I didn't know all the details. And reading this book, it made me have a lot more compassion for her, because I didn't know just how consistent the trauma was throughout her life. And there was a theme, and I don't want to give spoilers away, but I was fascinated by this theme in her life of how it seems like she basically constantly got shuffled from one exploitative, controlling, toxic situation to another. And it wasn't just from growing up in a cult to then Hollywood. Like in between, before she was ever famous, there were all these other moments, and typically it was getting shuffled from one man to the next. Like whether it was from her father to, now she's moving in with her stepfather, to now she's moving in with this like weirdo guy who's like kind of her boyfriend but kind of not, to then like this other guy. And I just thought that theme was so interesting as like a symbol in her life of the role that men have played, and how she was consistently kind of like stuck in these, almost I would even say trafficked from man to man, who either saw her as an object of his lust, or in like, let's say her father's case, an object of their control. Like she was a possession of these men from one hand to the next. And I that just kind of blew me away, that it seemed so obvious to me as I was reading it. And she kind of hinted at that theme, but she never explicitly said like, wow, isn't this so weird that I kept getting handed off, kind of like, a baton in track, right? In the relay race. It felt like she just kept getting transferred from one toxic situation, typically involving a man, to the next. It made me have more empathy towards her and her story. And it also made me wonder, like, because you can look at that with two perspectives, right? You could say, well, why didn't you wake up to the reality that this keeps happening to you? Why didn't you like work harder to create your own identity so you wouldn't have to depend on a man? Blah, 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 right? But you could also look at it as, wow, to grow up in a cult and to grow up essentially without any money to your name, and in a role where you constantly have to depend on a man because that's been instilled in you. It's just crazy to think like then she now, has, hindsight is 2020. She now looks back and sees all this. But I wonder if a lot of people grow up this way and then they're not even aware that they're constantly in like a codependent role. Like she never used the word codependency, but to me it's obvious that she was consistently in situations where she's dependent on a for nurturance. And me, as a boy, and especially as a gay boy, where I feel like I've never had that. Well, if I compare it to Rose McGowan, I don't want to call it a luxury, but I've never had the privilege or the I don't know what the word is, the entitlement of like, oh, well, a man will take care of me. And I have friends who I see that with. Like, I have a friend who was engaged and is now single, and she's like, damn, now I'm gonna have to pay for all these things on my own. Like, I'm gonna have to pay for rent. And in my mind, it was just so shocking because I've always had to take care of myself. Other than being in my parents' house until 18, other than that, I've always had to be responsible for myself. Like, the idea of a man paying for me is so foreign. But reading the book, I realized, wow, there's so many women in the world who are taught from a young age that's a man's job to take care of you, right? And again, it's easy to judge that, but reading this book made me realize, like, wow, if that's all you ever know, to the extreme of you were raised in a cult where you are taught to be somebody's possession, basically, right? I just thought it was fascinating. I recommend the book. I just think it's a fascinating life story. And being now at an age where I think about spirituality and life themes and, you know, are these things happening to you really a coincidence, or is it kind of like a lesson that you have to learn for yourself in terms of personal growth? It really made me wonder, like, did she just keep falling into shitty situations, or was she actually kind of attracting it? Not to say it's her fault. And that was one frustration for me reading the book, right? I feel like she's often still very angry at the world, and I understand that anger, but it's so not productive. And one of the things that is very important to me, and even like friends I have around me, it's important for me to be around people who take accountability for why they are where they are in life. Again, it's not about it being your fault, but at a certain point, you're like, this keeps happening in my life. Am I attracting this, right? If you keep attracting shitty guys, if you keep attracting shitty jobs, if you keep attracting shitty friends, how are you getting there? Like, why does that keep happening? And so I guess it was just one of those situations where in reading her book, it made me think about my own life. Like, okay, she has this pattern in her life. What toxic patterns do I have in my life that I've always been upset about, but like maybe there's more to it that I'm attracting it? So I enjoyed reading the book. Again, towards the end, she kind of started losing me again because I sensed that anger. It's more than anger, it really is rage. The last like 30 to 40 pages, it feels like a rant. It feels like a rant of how the world has wronged her, and how Hollywood has wronged her, and how men are so horrible to women and all this stuff. But again, to me, if you hyper focus on that, you're missing the bigger picture, which is that to me, none of this is about gender. Just like Black Lives Matter isn't just about race. It's about, to me, tribalism, that we live in this world where it's all about power, who has it, who doesn't. And it's been that way since the dawn of civilization. If you watch any documentaries on like cavemen and like back in the day when tribes, pre-modern agriculture tribes, I'm talking like Neanderthal, cavemen type tribes, because they were starving and didn't have resources, they would invade other tribes, right? Foreign tribes. Basically, that's our primitive version of war, right? They would come in, they would kill the men, they would rape the women, and they would claim the children as their own. Like, that was a thing that was done. So if that doesn't tell you, you know, our origins, which doesn't mean that we have to maintain that, right? Of course, I agree that there are solutions that need to be explored, and I think things like basic empathy and understanding other people's situations. But when she starts going on her whole like rampage about how men have to do better, to me it's so much bigger than men needing to do better. It's about people doing better, because for every man who has a toxic masculinity trait, there's also a woman who believes that, and believes that like only men should be presidents of the country, and only man should be the head of the household and all this stuff. She tells an amazing story, and she questions really interesting things, and I like the way her mind works, and I also love her creativity in the book, like the analogies and the imagery that she conjures. I just think sometimes she gets, I think she gets ahead of herself, especially towards the end of the book, where she goes on these rants that feel non-productive. One other thing I thought was really interesting in the book is she talks about her relationship with Marilyn Manson in the book, and how he basically healed her. Like, it was a healing relationship for her. With her just having had gone through her assault from Harvey Weinstein. And so to me, that was so interesting because at the time that she wrote this book, Marilyn Manson was not being hounded as part of this Me Too movement, but now he is. At the time of this video, the past year, there's been all these stories about him. He's been sued by several women who have basically said he's no better than these Bill Cosbys and Harvey Weinstein. So that is so interesting to me, how he was, for Rose McGowan, kind of like a savior, as a man who helped heal her and was good to her, but that he was a terror to these other women. And you could say the same, I'm sure, about Bill Cosby or Harvey Weinstein. I'm sure Harvey Weinstein was much better to his wife than to these other women he exploited. I'm sure Bill Cosby was better to his wife than he was to these other women that he exploited. But that is so interesting, that someone could be so kind and gracious to some individuals in their life and then to others be a total menace. And like, where does that come from? Why do people have selective empathy like that? And I think we all have selective empathy to an extent. And I wonder what Rose McGowan genuinely thinks about that situation, that like that her sort of hero, if we can say that, post her situation with Harvey Weinstein, that he would have been this horrible man, that he would have been a Harvey Weinstein to these other women. Like, I wonder how she feels about that irony that is relevant to her story. I know that she has said that she stands by that he was great to her, but that doesn't mean that he was definitely great to these other women, which I think is a very nuanced perspective that's important for her to share, right? Because a lot of women have come forward when these things have happened and been like, he never treated me that way. And it's like, that's great. That's great for you. That doesn't suddenly negate this other person's story. Curious what you guys think about this. Have you read the book? What are your thoughts on Rose McGowan? If you have any sort of context, would love to hear your take.